People say revenge is a dish best served cold. But in our kitchen, it was served at a rolling boil. And it burned absolutely everything to the ground. I've been a sous chef for 22 years. I've seen plates thrown, marriages ruined over a misplaced decimal in food costs, and chefs lose their minds to the heat. But I have never seen a slaughter quite as quiet or as methodical as what happened at Vance and Rossi. It was October 2019 when we got our first Michelin star. The restaurant was tucked into a high-rent corner of Tribeca. To the public, it was the crown jewel of Manhattan's new dining scene. To me, it was a pressure cooker. And Elena Rossi was the engine keeping it from exploding. Elena wasn't one of those celebrity chefs who showed up just to tweet a picture of a plated dish. She lived in the prep kitchen. She had dark circles under her eyes that never faded and a collection of burn scars on her forearms that she wore like service medals. Her bone marrow and black truffle risotto wasn't just food. It was an obsession. I watched her throw out 3 gallons of veal stock one Tuesday morning simply because the color was half a shade too light. That was Elena. The kitchen was her sanctuary, her religion. Then there was Julian Vance, her husband, the CEO. While Elena was sweating over a flat-top grill in a stained white chef's coat, Julian was out in the dining room. He wore bespoke navy suits that cost more than my monthly salary. He had this slicked-back hair and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. His job was to charm the food critics, wine and dine the investors, and collect the accolades. He was brilliant at it, but he couldn't cook an egg to save his life. I remember a specific night in December. We had just finished a brutal Friday dinner service. We did 240 covers. Elena was exhausted, sitting on an overturned milk crate near the walk-in fridge, rubbing her temples. Julian walked in. He didn't bring her a glass of water. He brought a stack of legal documents and a Mont Blanc pen. "Franchise agreements for the new Vegas location, babe," he said, his voice smooth as butter. "Just need your signature on the bottom lines so I can get these to the lawyers by Monday." Elena didn't even read them. She just took the pen and signed her name 6 times. She trusted him completely. She used to tell me, "Marcus, Julian handles the business, so I can handle the food. It's the perfect partnership." I stood there, wiping down my station, and I watched him slide those papers back into his leather briefcase. He looked at the signatures, and for a fraction of a second, the charismatic smile dropped. His eyes went dead, cold, and calculating. It was a look of pure ownership. Not of the restaurant. Of her. I should have said something right then. I should have told her to read what she was signing. But I had a mortgage in Queens and 2 kids in college. I was just a hired gun. I kept my mouth shut and went back to chopping onions. That silence is something I will have to live with for the rest of my life. Because those weren't just franchise agreements. She was signing away the rights to her own name. It started in February 2020. Julian brought her in through the back delivery doors. Chloe Thorne, 25, fresh out of some overpriced culinary institute in Paris, with a blonde bob that never seemed to lose its shape in the kitchen's humidity. She wore a tailored chef's coat that was blindingly white. It didn't have a single stain on it. In a kitchen like ours, a pristine coat doesn't mean you're a brilliant chef. It means you don't do any of the actual bleeding. Julian announced she was our new chef de cuisine. He said it was to lighten Elena's load. Elena didn't want her. I could see the tension in Elena's jaw every time Chloe touched a plate. Chloe didn't understand our menu at all. She tried to add edible gold leaf to a rustic venison dish. It was insulting. But Julian was relentless. He didn't just defend Chloe. He used her to dismantle Elena's confidence, piece by piece. He started playing a very specific, deeply cruel psychological game. "You look entirely exhausted, Elle," he'd say, his voice dripping with fake, manufactured concern as he stood near the pass. The rest of the crew, and I pretended not to listen. The reviewer from the Tribune mentioned the plating looked a little uninspired last week. "You're losing your edge. You're burning out." It was a complete lie. The Tribune had praised her. But when the person you sleep next to tells you you're falling apart, day after day, you slowly start to believe them. I watched Elena break down. She started doubting her own legendary palate. I saw her throwing away perfectly balanced reductions. She started drinking triple-shot espressos just to keep her hands from shaking during the dinner rush. She was drowning, and Julian was the one holding her head under the water, convincing her it was just the rain. By April, the vibrant, obsessed chef I knew was a ghost. That's when Julian made his final move for absolute control. It was a Tuesday afternoon, right around 3 p.m. The prep kitchen was mostly empty. I was inside the walk-in fridge, taking inventory of the dry-aged beef. I could see them clearly through the glass panels of the small back office. "Just 6 months, Elena," Julian was saying. He was standing behind her desk, softly rubbing her shoulders. "A medical sabbatical. Go to my family's place in Tuscany. Rest. Let Chloe handle the line for a while. I've got the lawyers drafting a temporary transfer of operational control. It just protects the restaurant's liability while you're away. It's just a formality, babe." Elena looked at the thick stack of paperwork. Her eyes were hollow, completely defeated. She was just too tired to fight him anymore. She just wanted the immense pressure in her chest to stop. She picked up the pen. I stood in the freezing cold of the walk-in, gripping my clipboard until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drop a 60-pound crate of ribs on the tile floor to break the trance. Temporary transfer of operational control. In the restaurant business, that's corporate speak for handing over the keys to the kingdom. But she signed the document, desperately thinking she was saving her mind and her marriage. Through the glass, I saw Chloe standing in the dark hallway, watching the whole thing unfold. When Elena's pen lifted from the paper, Chloe didn't smile. She just slowly, deliberately adjusted the cuffs of her immaculate white coat. She knew. Julian knew. The trap had just snapped shut, and Elena hadn't even felt the teeth. It was May 14th, a dreary Thursday morning. The restaurant was being prepped for the lunch rush, but the main dining room was still empty. Elena wasn't supposed to be there. She had been on her forced sabbatical for exactly 3 weeks, but she came in through the front doors at 10:30 a.m. to retrieve her custom carbon steel Nakiri knife. She never made it to the kitchen. I was by the espresso machine at the bar, wiping down the steam wand, when I heard the heavy glass doors pull open. I looked up and saw Elena freeze in the foyer. There, sitting at table 4, the VIP booth by the window, were Julian and Chloe. They weren't discussing food costs. Julian's hand was resting high on Chloe's thigh, his face leaning in close to hers. But honestly, I don't think the physical infidelity is what broke Elena. It was what was sitting on the table between them. It was a stack of freshly printed, heavy cardstock menus. Elena walked over, her movements eerily calm, like a sleepwalker. She picked one up. I could see her hands trembling from 15 feet away. At the top, the elegant gold leaf logo that used to say Vance and Rossi had been altered. The Rossi was gone. It just said Vance. And underneath, in bold, crisp letters, Executive Chef, Chloe Thorne. "What is this?" Elena's voice was barely a whisper, but in that cavernous room, it echoed like a gunshot. Julian didn't jump. He didn't look guilty. He just casually removed his hand from Chloe's leg and stood up, slowly buttoning his navy suit jacket. The charming, supportive husband was gone. In his place was a ruthless corporate liquidator looking at a bad investment. "It's a rebranding, Elena," he said, his tone as flat and cold as a stainless steel prep table. The board felt the menu needed a younger, more dynamic direction. "This is my restaurant," she fired back, the reality of the betrayal finally cracking her voice. "These are my recipes. You can't just erase me." Julian let out a short, patronizing sigh. "Actually, I can. And I did. Those operational transfer documents you signed in April? They included a standard intellectual property buyout. The LLC owns the recipes. The LLC owns the branding. And as of yesterday morning, we invoked the clause to terminate your employment. You don't own Vance, and you don't work here anymore." Elena stared at him. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, she grabbed a heavy crystal water pitcher from the table and smashed it against the hardwood floor. Water and glass exploded everywhere. Chloe let out a sharp shriek and backed away, but Julian didn't even flinch. He just calmly pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling the first precinct," he said smoothly. 15 minutes later, two NYPD officers walked through our front doors. They didn't care about who spent thousands of hours perfecting the menu. They didn't care about the burn scars on Elena's arms. They only cared about who held the legal lease. They escorted Elena out for trespassing. She wasn't allowed to go to the kitchen to get her knife. She wasn't even allowed to take her personal recipe notebooks. As she walked past the bar, flanked by the cops, she stopped and looked right at me. Her eyes weren't sad anymore. The devastation had already burned off. What was left was completely dead, cold, and terrifying. That was the exact moment the woman who loved cooking died, and something much, much more dangerous took her place. It took her exactly 42 days. I know because I counted every single one of them. From the prep kitchen window of Vance and Rossi, right across the street, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a failing bodega, was a dilapidated diner that had been boarded up for years. In late June, the brown paper finally came off the glass. There was no grand opening, no PR campaign, no investors in tailored suits. There wasn't even a sign above the door. There was just a small, weathered chalkboard resting on the sidewalk. It read, "Service at 6 p.m. 12 seats. No reservations." I watched from our spotless, empty kitchen as the first few nights went by. Julian stood by the host stand and actually laughed out loud. He told Chloe that Elena was having a public psychotic break. But Julian wasn't paying attention to the numbers. He didn't notice that our Friday night books, usually filled 3 months in advance, were suddenly showing glaring, impossible gaps. Inside Vance and Rossi, the illusion was rapidly shattering. Chloe simply couldn't handle the volume or the pressure. She didn't understand that Elena's recipes weren't just lists of ingredients. They were complex symphonies of timing and intuition. Chloe was consistently sending out lamb that was over-rested and scallops that bounced like rubber. Our food cost percentage skyrocketed from a healthy 28% to a disastrous 41% because she was constantly throwing away ruined, expensive proteins. Meanwhile, 20 yards away, Elena was executing a masterclass in psychological warfare. She began poaching our top-tier VIPs, not by calling them, not by begging, but by exploiting the very palate she had cultivated in them. Mr. Henderson, a ruthless hedge fund manager, who dined with us every Tuesday for the signature duck breast, walked out of our dining room in August after a 20-minute delay on his appetizer. As he stood on the curb waiting for his driver, fuming and hungry, Elena stepped out of her tiny, unair-conditioned kitchen. She was wiping her hands on a heavily stained apron. She didn't say a word. She just handed him a small, unmarked box and walked back inside. I later found out from his driver that it contained a single, perfectly executed duck confit croquette. The next Tuesday, Henderson didn't come to our glass doors. Through the window, I watched him sitting on a cheap metal stool across the street, eating directly from Elena's cramped counter. And he had brought 3 of his billionaire partners with him. It was a slow, agonizing public bleed. Every single night, Julian would stand at our front window, his bespoke navy suit looking just a little looser on his frame, his jaw tight. He was forced to watch as the line for Elena's nameless, 12-seat diner started wrapping around the city block. By October, the culinary blogs had caught on. They didn't just praise Elena's triumphant return to pure, unpretentious cooking. They actively compared her brilliant, soulful plates to the lifeless, overpriced corporate husks being served at Vance and Rossi. Elena wasn't just stealing his money. She was destroying his ego right in front of his face, one plate at a time. By November, the inevitable happened. The new Michelin guide for New York was released. Vance and Rossi didn't just lose their star. They were entirely removed from the printed guide. The review in the Times that followed was a complete bloodbath. The critic called the food a tragic, plastic imitation of a once great legacy and explicitly noted the glaring absence of Elena's signature touch. That was the killing blow. The investors panicked and demanded their capital back. But the LLC was completely leveraged. Julian tried to sell the brand, But buyers aren't stupid. They knew the Vance name was completely worthless without the Rossi talent behind it. Chloe didn't stick around to bail out the sinking ship. She packed up her pristine white chef coats and left on a rainy Tuesday morning. I heard she took a job at a corporate hotel in Chicago. She left Julian entirely alone in a massive, multi-million-dollar kitchen that he literally didn't know how to turn on. The absolute end came on November 18th, the week before Thanksgiving. I arrived at 8 a.m. to start my prep shift. But my key card didn't work. There was a heavy iron padlock on the front glass doors, and a neon orange foreclosure notice from First Republic Bank taped right at eye level. Chapter 11 Bankruptcy. Julian was already there. He was standing on the freezing Tribeca sidewalk, wearing a thin gray overcoat over his bespoke suit. The arrogance was completely gone. He looked 10 years older, shivering in the wind. He was holding a small, cheap cardboard box with a few desk items. He had nothing else. No restaurant, no brand, no money, and no wife. He slowly turned his head and looked across the narrow street. Elena's diner was already bustling with the morning breakfast crowd. Through the fogged front glass, you could clearly see her. She was wiping down the counter, laughing genuinely with a customer. Then she stopped. She looked up and met Julian's eyes through the heavy morning rain. For a long, agonizing moment, the two of them just stared at each other across the wet asphalt. Julian looked entirely broken. I think he was waiting for some kind of reaction. A smirk, a nod of victory. Anything to acknowledge that he still mattered to her, even as an enemy. But Elena didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just looked at him with the absolute, chilling indifference you reserve for a piece of trash blowing down the street. Then, she simply turned her back, picked up her battered carbon steel Nakiri knife, and went back to chopping vegetables. She had taken back her life, her art, and her dignity. And she had left him with absolutely nothing but the bitter taste of his own greed. And that is where the story ends. Or perhaps where the next one begins. If this story made you think twice about who you trust, subscribe to Shadows of Trust for more stories of loyalty, betrayal, and the prices people pay. Like this video if it kept you watching until the end. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. We'll be back soon with another story from the shadows. Until then, watch who you trust.